history's mysteries, ghost ships, haunting secrets of the Pacific War. The vastness of the Pacific Ocean, with its seemingly endless expanse of water and sky, holds secrets as deep as its fathoms. During World War II, the Pacific Theater was the setting for some of the most brutal naval battles in history. Fleets clashed, thousands of sailors were lost, and entire ships vanished beneath the waves. It was a time of courage, sacrifice, and unimaginable loss. But even as the war ended, stories began to surface. Strange tales whispered among sailors, passed from ship to ship. These were stories of ghostly vessels, spectral crews, and unexplained phenomena encountered in the vast, empty stretches of the Pacific. Ships that had been sunk reappeared, their decks eerily silent. Mysterious lights danced on the water, and shadowy figures were glimpsed moving through the mist. Here are 4 chilling accounts of ghost ships witnessed by sailors in the aftermath of the Pacific War, stories that blur the line between history and the supernatural. Story 1. The Phantom Fleet of Iron Bottom Sound. Iron Bottom Sound is a name whispered with reverence and dread by those who know its history. Nestled between Guadalcanal, Savo Island, and Florida Island in the Solomon Islands, this stretch of water earned its grim moniker during World War II. From 1942 to 1943, it became the site of relentless naval battles between the Allied and Japanese forces. Ship after ship was sunk, and thousands of sailors met their end in these unforgiving waters. Even now, decades later, the ocean floor is littered with wrecks, battleships, destroyers, and cruisers, their rusting hulls entombing the remains of the men who fought and died there. The sea above, however, is eerily tranquil, a stark contrast to the chaos that once consumed it. By 1946, the war had ended, but the stories emerging from Iron Bottom Sound suggested that the battle was far from over. It was in this haunted expanse that Lieutenant William Carson of the USS Charleston witnessed something he would never forget: a fleet of ghostly ships steaming silently through the darkness. The USS Charleston, a light cruiser tasked with post-war patrols, was cruising through Iron Bottom Sound on a humid night in June 1946. Its crew was a mix of seasoned sailors who had survived the war and younger recruits eager to prove themselves in a new peacetime navy. Lieutenant Carson, a man of 35 with a sharp mind and a steady hand, stood on the bridge. Though the war had left its mark on him, he found a strange comfort in the sea. Tonight, however, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. The sound was unusually quiet, the usual chatter of the crew subdued. Even the ocean seemed unnaturally calm, its surface like black glass reflecting the faint starlight above. Carson scanned the horizon with his binoculars, the faint hum of the ship's engines the only sound in the stillness. "Hardly feels like the same place," said Ensign Mitchell, a younger officer standing beside him. "Can you imagine what it was like here during the war?" Carson lowered his binoculars and nodded. "I don't have to imagine," he replied. "I was here back in '42. It wasn't quiet like this. You could feel the tension in the air, like the whole world was holding its breath." Mitchell hesitated. "You ever hear the stories about the ghost ships?" Carson smirked, though his eyes remained on the horizon. "You believe in that kind of thing?" "I don't know," Mitchell admitted. "But a place like this, it feels like it could hold on to something, you know? Like the souls of the men who died here never really left." Carson was about to reply when he noticed something on the horizon, a faint, flickering light. "Contact, port side," Carson called, raising his binoculars again. The light grew brighter, and as the seconds ticked by, more lights appeared, forming a line that stretched across the water. "General quarters," Carson ordered, his voice steady despite the chill running down his spine. The alarm echoed through the ship, and the crew sprang into action, manning their stations with practiced efficiency. As the Charleston adjusted its course, the lights became clearer, revealing the shapes of ships. Dozens of them, their silhouettes outlined against the faint glow of their running lights. Carson's breath caught as he recognized the distinct profiles of Japanese warships. Sleek destroyers, towering cruisers, and even the faint outline of a battleship. "What the hell?" Mitchell muttered, his face pale. "Those ships there. They're sunk," Carson finished, his voice barely above a whisper. The Charleston's radar operator called up to the bridge. "Nothing on the scope, sir. It's just us out here." Carson felt a chill run down his spine. "That's not possible," he muttered, gripping the railing. The Charleston drew closer to the Phantom fleet, its engines humming softly. Carson could see the details now. The tattered flags fluttering in a wind that didn't exist, the scorch marks on the hulls, and the gaping holes left by torpedoes and shell fire. But what unnerved him most were the figures on the decks. Shadowy shapes moved silently among the ghostly ships, their faces obscured, but their postures unmistakable. Sailors at their stations, as if preparing for battle. One figure stood at the edge of a cruiser, his hand raised in a silent salute. Carson's chest tightened as their eyes seemed to meet, dark, hollow eyes that carried an ocean of sorrow. "Sir," said a voice behind him, breaking Carson's trance. It was Chief Petty Officer Hayes, a grizzled veteran of the Pacific War. "What do we do?" Carson hesitated. What could they do? These weren't living ships, and no amount of firepower would drive them away. "Hold course," he said finally. "Let's see what they do." As the Charleston continued its approach, the ghostly fleet began to fade. The lights dimmed, the outlines of the ships dissolving into the darkness. The figures on the decks disappeared last, their shadowy forms lingering for a moment before vanishing completely. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the horizon was empty. The Charleston floated alone in the still waters of Iron Bottom Sound, the ghostly fleet gone without a trace. The crew stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had seen settling over them. Carson lowered his binoculars, his hands trembling. He felt as though he had just witnessed a funeral procession, a solemn parade of souls forever bound to the waters where they had fallen. The next morning, Carson filed his report, detailing the encounter as best he could. It was met with skepticism by his superiors, who dismissed the sighting as a mirage or an overactive imagination. But Carson knew what he had seen, and so did his crew. For weeks afterward, the men of the Charleston spoke in hushed tones about the ghostly fleet, their stories becoming part of the growing lore of Iron Bottom Sound. Divers who explored the wrecks reported strange phenomena, voices echoing through the water, cold currents that seemed to grip them like unseen hands, and the feeling of being watched. Carson himself never returned to Iron Bottom Sound, but the memory of that night stayed with him until his death. In his later years, he would describe the encounter as both terrifying and humbling, a reminder of the sacrifices made during the war and the lingering presence of those who had given their lives. Today, the stories of the Phantom fleet of Iron Bottom Sound remain a chilling testament to the enduring power of the ocean's memory, where history and the supernatural collide. For those who venture into these haunted waters, the echoes of the past are never far away. Story 2. The Silent Carrier of Leyte Gulf. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Fought in October 1944, it was a sprawling engagement involving hundreds of ships across several theaters in the waters around the Philippines. For Japan, it was a last-ditch effort to halt the advancing American forces. For the United States, it was a critical step in liberating the Philippines and closing in on the Japanese homeland. Amid the chaos of the battle, the Japanese aircraft carrier Zuikaku met its end. Once a proud member of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the last surviving carrier of the Pearl Harbor attack fleet, the Zuikaku was struck by multiple bombs and torpedoes. Its deck crumbled, its hull broke apart, and its sailors plunged into the sea. Hundreds went down with the ship, their bodies swallowed by the waves. Though the wreck of the Zuikaku was never officially located, the waters where it sank became the focus of chilling stories. One of the most famous encounters came years later, in 1952, when the USS Monroe, a U.S. Navy supply ship, reported a ghostly sighting that would haunt its crew forever. It was a humid, foggy morning in late summer when the USS Monroe sailed through Leyte Gulf on a routine supply mission. The war had ended years earlier, and the Monroe's crew of sailors and Marines was used to the monotony of post-war service, delivering food, equipment, and mail to scattered naval bases. The ship's captain, Commander Robert Harker, was a practical man. A seasoned officer who had served in the Pacific Theater, Harker was respected for his calm demeanor and sharp instincts. His crew trusted him implicitly, and he trusted the sea, though he never underestimated it. Harker stood on the bridge, sipping coffee and squinting at the dense fog that clung to the water like a shroud. Visibility was poor, the kind of conditions that made him uneasy. Still, the Gulf was quiet, and no other ships were expected in the area. The crew went about their duties, their voices carrying faintly across the deck. But beneath the routine hum of activity, there was a subtle tension, as though the fog itself held something just out of sight. Contact off the starboard bow. The shout came from the lookout, stationed high above the deck in the crow's nest. Harker straightened, lowering his coffee cup as he turned toward the rail. "What is it?" he called, his voice calm but firm. The lookout leaned forward, his binoculars trained on the horizon. "Looks like a carrier, sir. It's hard to tell in this fog, but it's a big one." "A carrier?" Harker frowned. There were no American carriers scheduled to be in the area, and none would be operating alone. "Bring us closer," Harker ordered, his unease growing. The Monroe's engines rumbled as the ship adjusted course, cutting through the fog. The sailors on deck murmured to each other, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the mysterious vessel. As the Monroe approached, the shape of the ship became clearer. It was indeed an aircraft carrier, its massive silhouette looming out of the mist like a phantom. But something was wrong. The ship's deck was tilted, its hull riddled with scorch marks and jagged holes. "It looks like it's been through hell," one sailor muttered. Harker raised his binoculars, his jaw tightening as he studied the ship. The carrier was battered, as though it had just emerged from a fierce battle. Its markings were barely visible, but they were unmistakable. The rising sun of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Monroe closed the distance, its crew now gathered at the rails, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and dread. The carrier loomed larger, its silent presence oppressive. "Why aren't they answering us?" Harker asked, his voice low. The Monroe's radio operator had been sending hails for the past 5 minutes, but there was no response. The radar showed nothing, as though the ship didn't exist. "Maybe it's abandoned," suggested Lieutenant Carter, the ship's executive officer. "Abandoned?" Harker repeated, his tone skeptical. A carrier that size wouldn't be drifting unnoticed in these waters. It would have been reported. He raised his binoculars again, scanning the carrier's deck. His breath caught as he saw movement. A figure, barely visible, walking along the edge of the flight deck. "There's someone up there," he said. The Monroe slowed as it approached the ghostly ship, its engines humming softly. The crew watched in silence, their earlier chatter forgotten. The carrier seemed almost alive, its damaged hull groaning faintly as the waves lapped against it. Harker felt a chill as he continued to watch the figure on the deck. It was a man, his posture rigid, his uniform unmistakably Japanese. The man stopped at the edge of the flight deck, turning to face the Monroe. For a moment, Harker thought the figure raised a hand in a gesture of acknowledgement, or perhaps warning. "Sir," Carter said, his voice tight. "We should back off." Harker nodded, his instincts telling him the same. "All engines reverse," he ordered. But before the Monroe could retreat, the carrier began to fade. Its massive hull dissolved into the fog, its outline flickering like a mirage. The figure on the deck was the last to disappear, his haunting gaze lingering in Harker's mind. The Monroe's crew was left stunned, their nerves frayed by the encounter. When the ship reached its destination, Harker filed a report with his superiors, detailing the sighting in precise, professional language. But the response was dismissive. There were no Japanese carriers still afloat, and no explanation was offered. For weeks, the crew of the Monroe couldn't stop talking about the silent carrier. Some claimed it was the Zuikaku, forever doomed to haunt the waters where it had fallen. Others dismissed the sighting as an optical illusion, a trick of the fog and light. Years later, the wreck of the Zuikaku was discovered, lying broken and silent on the ocean floor. But the sightings of a ghostly carrier continued, reported by fishermen, sailors, and even commercial pilots. For those who sailed through Leyte Gulf, the legend of the silent carrier remained a chilling reminder of the war's lingering echoes. And for Commander Harker, the memory of the man on the flight deck, standing watch over a ship long lost to history, was one he would never forget. Story 3. The Burning Destroyer of Truk Lagoon. Truk Lagoon, located in the remote waters of Micronesia, was once a critical hub for the Imperial Japanese Navy. During World War II, it served as a heavily fortified base for Japanese ships, submarines, and aircraft, bristling with weaponry and bustling with activity. But in February 1944, during Operation Hailstone, American forces launched a devastating airstrike on the lagoon, sinking dozens of ships and destroying hundreds of planes in just 2 days. The once formidable base became a watery graveyard, its waters stained with oil and blood. Today, Truk Lagoon is a diver's paradise, its wrecks preserved as eerie time capsules beneath the waves. But it is also a place of legend, where stories of ghostly phenomena abound. Divers speak of cold currents that seem to grasp at them, muffled cries echoing through the wrecks, and spectral figures glimpsed in the water. One of the most chilling tales is that of the Burning Destroyer, a ship that appears in the lagoon, engulfed in flames, only to vanish before anyone can reach it. In 1960, a group of local fishermen encountered the ghostly vessel, an experience that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The sun had long since set, leaving the waters of Truk Lagoon in darkness. A gentle breeze stirred the surface, and the stars above glittered in the cloudless sky. For fishermen, Hiroshi, Kenji, Akio, and Masaru were out on the lagoon, their small wooden boat bobbing gently in the waves. The men were locals, born and raised in the islands surrounding Truk Lagoon. Fishing was not just their livelihood, but a way of life, a connection to the ocean that sustained them. Though the war had left its scars on the lagoon, the fishermen rarely thought about the wrecks that lay below. To them, the sunken ships were part of the landscape, their rusting hulks silent and still. Hiroshi, the eldest of the group, leaned back against the side of the boat, his weathered face illuminated by the moonlight. "We'll head back soon," he said, his voice low. "The fish are slowing, and the night's getting long." Kenji nodded, hauling in the last of the lines. But as he reached for the oars, a faint orange glow appeared on the horizon. "What's that?" Akio asked, pointing toward the light. The others turned to look. The glow flickered like fire, growing brighter with each passing moment. "Must be another fishing boat," Masaru suggested, though his voice held a note of uncertainty. "No boat out here would carry a light that bright," Hiroshi replied, his brow furrowed. "It looks like flames." The fishermen watched in silence as the glow intensified, revealing the outline of a ship. It was a large vessel, its hull wreathed in flames that licked high into the night sky. The fire roared, casting an orange glow across the water, but no smoke rose from the inferno. "It's on fire," Kenji exclaimed, his voice tinged with alarm. "We have to help them." Hiroshi hesitated. Something about the burning ship felt wrong, unnatural, but he couldn't let his doubts outweigh the possibility of saving lives. "Row toward it," he said firmly. The men grabbed the oars, their boat cutting through the waves as they made their way toward the ship. As they drew closer, the details of the vessel became clearer. It was a Japanese destroyer, its deck crowded with figures. The sailors moved frantically, their silhouettes stark against the flames. "They're trapped," Akio shouted. But as the fishermen approached, they realized something was off. The sailors made no sound, not a single shout or cry for help. The destroyer itself was eerily silent, the roar of the flames muted as though the fire belonged to another world. The fishermen slowed their approach, their initial urgency giving way to unease. Hiroshi squinted at the figures on the deck, his heart pounding. The sailors' movements were strange, repetitive, almost mechanical, as if they were acting out a scene in an endless loop. Masaru's hands tightened on the oars. "Why aren't they calling out to us?" he whispered. Kenji's face was pale. "Because they're not alive. Hiroshi felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at the destroyer again, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The flames consumed the ship, yet its hull remained intact, the fire leaving no scorch marks. The sailors continued their frantic movements, oblivious to the fisherman's presence. "We shouldn't be here," Akio said, his voice trembling. "We need to go." Before Hiroshi could respond, the destroyer began to flicker, its outline wavering like a mirage. The flames dimmed, and the figures on the deck grew fainter, their frantic gestures slowing as though they were being pulled back into the past. The fishermen watched in stunned silence as the ship dissolved into the darkness, leaving only the ripples of their own boat on the now empty water. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Hiroshi broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "Row back to shore. Now!" The men obeyed, their oars cutting through the water with desperate urgency. None of them looked back, afraid of what they might see. When the fishermen returned to the village, they told their story to the elders, their voices hushed with fear. The older men listened in silence, their faces grim. "You saw the burning destroyer," one of them said finally. "It's not the first time it's appeared, and it won't be the last." The elders explained that the destroyer was one of the many ships sunk during Operation Hailstone, its crew trapped aboard as the vessel went down in flames. Some believed the ship was cursed, reliving its fiery end for eternity. Others thought it was a warning, a reminder of the lives lost in the lagoon's waters. In the years that followed, the fisherman's story spread, becoming part of the lore of Truck Lagoon. Divers exploring the wrecks reported hearing faint voices and feeling unseen hands brushing against them in the water. Some claimed to see flickering lights beneath the surface, as though the destroyer's flames were still burning in the depths. For Hiroshi and his companions, the memory of that night never faded. They rarely spoke of the burning destroyer, but when they did, their voices carried the weight of fear and reverence. Even now, Truck Lagoon remains a place of both wonder and unease, its sunken ships a haunting reminder of the war's devastating toll. And for those who venture onto its waters at night, the glow of the burning destroyer may still appear, a ghostly echo of a ship that refuses to be forgotten. Story 4. The Lights of the USS Indianapolis. The USS Indianapolis holds one of the most harrowing legacies of World War II. In July 1945, the heavy cruiser delivered critical components for the atomic bomb to Tinian Island. Days later, while sailing unescorted through the Philippine Sea, it was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. The ship sank in just 12 minutes, taking 300 sailors with it. For the 900 men who survived the initial sinking, the nightmare was only beginning. Drifting in open water without lifeboats or sufficient supplies, they endured 4 days of exposure, dehydration, and relentless shark attacks. By the time rescue came, only 316 men remained alive. In the decades that followed, stories began to surface of strange phenomena in the area where the Indianapolis sank. Some claimed to see ghostly lights beneath the water. Others spoke of shadowy figures watching from the waves. These tales reached their peak in 1978, when the crew of the USS Roosevelt reported an encounter that still chills those who hear it. The USS Roosevelt, a Navy destroyer, was making a routine transit through the Philippine Sea on a calm, clear night in the summer of 1978. The ship was well manned, its crew a mix of seasoned officers and younger sailors eager to prove themselves. Among them was Lieutenant Commander David Ross, the ship's executive officer. Ross stood on the bridge, leaning against the railing as he gazed out at the endless expanse of water. The stars above were bright, their reflections shimmering on the calm sea. It was a peaceful night, the kind that could almost make you forget the ocean's darker secrets. "Hard to believe this is where it happened," said Ensign Taylor, one of the younger officers, as he joined Ross. Ross nodded, knowing exactly what the ensign meant. The Indianapolis had sunk somewhere in these waters, though its precise location remained a mystery. The tragedy loomed large in naval history, a haunting reminder of the sea's unforgiving nature. They say the survivors could see the shark's eyes glowing in the dark, Taylor added, his voice low. Can you imagine? Ross didn't respond. He had read the accounts, heard the survivors' stories of terror and endurance. He had no desire to imagine it. The calm was broken shortly after midnight. The lookout on the forward deck reported strange lights in the water, faint but distinct, moving beneath the surface. Ross grabbed a pair of binoculars and stepped onto the deck. Scanning the dark water, he spotted them, soft, glowing orbs drifting just below the surface. They moved in an erratic pattern, circling and weaving as if guided by unseen hands. Bioluminescent plankton? Taylor suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Ross shook his head. Plankton doesn't move like that. The crew gathered along the rails, their murmurs growing louder as more lights appeared. They formed an eerie outline, resembling the shape of a large ship, a hull, a deck, even the faint impression of gun turrets. "What the hell is that?" one sailor muttered, his voice tinged with unease. The lights began to rise, breaking the surface with a faint hiss that sent shivers down Ross's spine. The outline of the Indianapolis grew sharper, its ghostly form glowing softly against the dark sea. The ship appeared battered, its hull torn and twisted, as if still bearing the scars of the torpedoes that had sunk it. Shadowy figures moved along the deck, sailors, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes fixed on the Roosevelt. Ross felt a wave of emotion that wasn't his own, grief, despair, and a deep, aching sorrow. It was as if the spirits of the Indianapolis were reaching out, desperate to be seen, to be remembered. "Sir, what do we do?" Taylor asked, his voice trembling. Ross swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "We hold position. No one goes overboard." The figures on the ghostly ship moved with a strange rhythm, as though trapped in an endless loop of their final moments. Some stood at attention, their hands raised in silent salutes. Others pointed toward the Roosevelt, their gestures urgent but soundless. And then, faintly, Ross heard it, a distant cry carried on the wind. "Help us!" The voice was faint but unmistakable, a plea that seemed to echo from the depths of time. The sailors on the Roosevelt froze, their eyes wide as the ghostly figures began to flicker, their forms growing translucent. "Help us!" The voice came again, louder this time, filled with anguish. Ross clenched the railing, his knuckles white. He wanted to respond, to offer some kind of comfort, but he knew there was nothing he could do. These weren't men he could save. They were shadows, echoes of a tragedy that could never be undone. The glowing outline of the Indianapolis began to dissolve, the lights sinking back into the depths. The ghostly sailors vanished one by one, their expressions etched into Ross's memory. Within moments, the sea was calm again, the surface unbroken. The crew of the Roosevelt stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had witnessed settling over them. "Log it," Ross said finally, his voice hoarse. "Every detail." When the Roosevelt returned to port, Ross filed a detailed report, describing the encounter as objectively as possible. The Navy's response was brief and dismissive, attributing the sighting to natural phenomena or mass hysteria. But Ross and his crew knew the truth. They had seen the Indianapolis, its ghostly form rising from the depths, its sailors still calling out for help decades after their deaths. The incident became a source of hushed conversations and rumors among the Navy, adding to the growing legend of the Indianapolis. Years later, when the wreck was finally discovered over 18,000 feet below the surface, divers reported strange occurrences: flickering lights, sudden temperature drops, and the feeling of being watched. For Ross, the memory of that night remained vivid until the end of his life. In his quieter moments, he often thought of the ghostly sailors, their silent salutes, and their haunting plea, "Help us." The story of the Indianapolis and its ghostly appearances is a testament to the lasting scars of war. For those who sail the Philippine Sea, the waters remain a place of reverence and mystery, where the past refuses to be forgotten. And on certain nights, when the sea is calm and the stars shine bright, sailors may still see the lights of the Indianapolis, a spectral reminder of the men who sacrificed everything in the name of duty. The ghost ships of the Pacific War remain a chilling reminder of the ocean's memory, a vast, unyielding graveyard where the dead refuse to be forgotten. Whether these sightings are the result of lingering energy, sailor's guilt, or something beyond understanding, they continue to captivate and unnerve those who sail the waters of the Pacific, where history and the supernatural collide.